Thank you very much, Mr Acting Deputy President. And I did want to speak this evening on the actual topic. I did want to speak on, science. And I will still hopefully get to science, but after Senator Bilyk spent just a bit under 20 minutes speaking about politics, and she spoke about politics in a very misleading way. I think at the end there she said the Labor has a vision. Well, she certainly had visions in that speech, because they weren't actually based in fact at all. And I just want to point out a few of the mistruths in this, and I might actually use some facts while I do that. I did pick up there that Senator Bilyk, through you, Mr Acting Deputy President, said that there'd been over $1 billion in cuts from R&D tax credits under this government. Well, it surprised me a bit that she attributed those to this government, because they were actually announced by the previous government. Those cuts, Mr Acting Deputy President, was their policy in government. And just to make sure that the Australian public, that I'm not misleading the Senate, I've actually got some facts here in front of me that Senator Bilyk didn't have. I've got a press release here from Mr Wayne Swan on when was this press release put out? The 27th of June 2013. Mr Wayne Swan put this press release out, and he said that the R&D tax incentive is one of the most important elements of the government support for innovation system. It will continue to provide generous, easy-to-access support for around 10,000 companies each year undertaking eligible R&D, and this is the kicker: the change will affect less than 20 corporate groups, and this will ensure this support is better targeted at small to medium businesses. He was envisaging exactly what this government's done, which is focus the R&D tax credit on small and medium enterprises, not large companies. He went on to say that savings from the reforms, estimated at over $1 billion from 2014 to 2017, will fund government priorities, including measures announced in the government's policy statement, a plan for Australian jobs. So Senator Bilyk has just spent a fair amount of time of her speech criticising Labor Party policy, which I'm not objecting to. If that's how Senator Bilyk wants to use her time in this chamber, we should give her an extension of time. We should hear more from Senator Bilyk more often, so that she can expose in more detail the deficiencies of Labor's approach to policy making in this country. I also heard that Senator Bilyk said that CSIRO has had job losses, and that is a fact. That CSIRO, unfortunately, has had job losses in the past few years. Again, what Senator Bilyk didn't mention was that, in fact, the around 1,000 reduction in staff numbers in the CSIRO of the past few years, 600 of those actually occurred between the 30th of June 2013 and the end of 2014, almost completely during the Labor government, except for those last few months of the 2014. She didn't say that, Senator Ronaldson. I didn't hear that. I just want to check, though. Did you hear that? Did you hear her say that? I might not have heard all of her speech, but I don't think she mentioned that 600 of those job losses were actually under the Labor government. And indeed, the other 400 that have unfortunately been made redundant since were actually a consequence of the efficiency dividends that the Labor Party put in place while they were in government. While they were in government, they subjected to government agencies and departments, not just the CSIRO, but all government departments and agencies, to efficiency dividends. And I'm not criticising that practice. That's something that all governments do from time to time, but that was a decision they made, and the result of that decision obviously means that agencies and departments have to cut their costs. And when they have to cut their costs, often they have to do so through their staffing costs, because most departments and agencies of the Commonwealth have as their labour costs as their biggest part of their budget. They're only going to meet these efficiency dividends by reducing staff numbers. Senator Bilyk should know that. Certainly the government at the time would have known that. That would have been the advice they would have got from Treasury and Finance, and that was a consequence of their decision. They should have the guts to own up to the consequences of their own decisions that they made in government. Now, I also note that Senator Bilyk mentioned the RV Investigator, which was a CSIRO vessel, and she's saying that apparently we aren't funding the RV Investigator as much as they did. Well, I have the budget papers right here in front of me, Senator Bilyk, from 2013 and 14, the budget paper number 2, which is the final budget that the Labor government announced before they were dismissed at the last election. Now, on page 214 of budget paper 2 in 2013-14, there's a measure to do with the CSIRO, Marine National Facility operational funding. And under that measure, it says the government will provide, this is the Labor government, will provide $12.1 million to the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organisation to conduct sea trials of Australia's new Marine National Facility vessel, RV Investigator. So they funded it by $12.1 million. What Senator Bilyk failed to actually outline is what was the funding they provided beyond 2013-14. What do you think it would have been, Senator Roddleston? If you could hazard a guess. Senator Bilyk didn't mention it, but presumably Senator Bilyk was expecting this ship would continue to be used. She said it should be used, I think, 180 days a year or something like that. And that's what she wants it to be used. Well, you would think through you, Acting Deputy Premier, Senator Bilyk would have wanted the Labor government to actually fund it to get out for 180 days a year. But let's just look at the budget papers. There's a table, and under 2013-14 there is $12.1 million. And just to be clear for Senator Bilyk, under 2014 and 15, what number is there? Zero. Under 2015-16, what number is there? Zero. Under 2016-17, what number is there? Zero. 3 zeros, 3 strikes for Senator Bilyk. There was no funding provided by the former Labor government for the RV Investigator. We have provided funding for it, perhaps not as much as Senator Bilyk would have liked, but it's much, much more funding than her own government put forward to it. Indeed, it's so much more funding you can't even calculate it because you can't calculate a percentage from zero. Now, the final point I want to make on Senator Bilyk's contribution is, well, Senator Carr earlier as well was talking about the terrible impacts of funding cuts to CSIRO. Well, it is very interesting to point out that in 2008, Labor actually cut $63.4 million from the CSIRO budget. And what's even more interesting, that the then Science and Innovation Minister, Senator Kim Carr, who now speaks so sanctimoniously about science funding, he said at the time, he admitted that the cuts had to be tough, and I quote, because we're fighting a war on inflation. We're fighting a war on inflation. Do you remember the war on inflation, Senator Roddleston? That was a difficult war, wasn't it? That was a tough war we all had to get through there in mid-2008. As soon as the war on inflation was ended, what did they have next? A war on obesity? I think they had a war on obesity. How did that one go? Senator Roddleston, how's the war on obesity going for you? I'm still struggling a bit with that war. They had the war on obesity. Then they had the building education revolution. They were a very violent government. They had all these revolutions and wars. And then, of course, they had a coup, and they got rid of 2 prime ministers, and then another one for good measure, I think, as well. So that was the Labor government. That was the Labor government. They had a record of cutting funding to science, and now they sanctimoniously come into this chamber and criticise this government for doing the same thing. They did indeed criticise them sometimes for implementing the very policies they announced only a few years ago. It's been an amazing conversion, an amazing road to Damascus for the Labor Party in the last 18 months. Now, I did actually, as I said, I did want to speak on science, and I now have more limited time to do so, but I would still like to do so because I think it's important in National Science Week that we as representatives in our nation's parliament do not just engage in politics here. And sorry, and I apologise I had to do that, but I did have to point out those errors. But I did actually want to speak a little bit about science itself and how important it is, and my concerns too at times of the state of science, not just here in Australia but around the world. I want to talk about a guy called Karl Popper, who I feel share some affinity with, because Karl Popper once thought of himself as a communist for a few days, apparently, and I too once thought of myself as a communist. I think I might have sinned for a little bit longer than a few days, but when I started university I thought, yep, communism, that's the way to go. Let's share the wealth, let's all be happy and not have competing interests and base capitalistic or profit motive interests. That's what I thought. And I soon discovered I was wrong. When I met some communists, I soon, Mr Acting Deputy President, discovered that I was very, very wrong. I was a bit of a loner in high school in my Marxist days, but once I got to university, as you would probably appreciate, Mr Acting Deputy President, there were some actual real communists at university, and when I met them, I thought these guys are on a different track than me. So I did learn. I did hopefully accede to the aphorism that I think attributed to Churchill, that if you're not a communist when you're 20, you don't have a heart, and if you're still one when you're 30, you don't have a brain. And hopefully I have acceded to that. Now, that's probably where my affinity with Karl Popper does end, because Karl Popper, to those who are listening who don't know, was one of the most famous philosophers in the 20th century, one of the most influential, at least, certainly, philosophers in the 20th century, and I certainly won't achieve those goals. Notwithstanding the fact I certainly can't be a great philosopher in the 20th century, having been born in 1980, but I don't think I'll be a great philosopher of the 21st century either. But what Karl Popper was famous for was the philosophy of science. And I listened in the chamber before to Senator Rice's contribution, and she is a scientist, and she spoke about how she's a scientist because she believes in rational and logical thought. But I didn't actually feel that Senator Rice succinctly or clearly summed up what her philosophy of science is, because it's a very important thing to think about, well, what is science? What does it mean? What can we take away from people that do science and apply science? And Karl Popper had quite a revolutionary idea that science is not about creating conclusions from observing the real world, that it's not about making positive statements or truthful statements about what we see around the world. What it is actually about is putting forward hypotheses, or in more colloquial terms, conjectures about the world, and then trying to test them and seeing if they can be falsified. So he used the example of Albert Einstein had a theory. He had a hypothesis. He had a hypothesis that light would be distorted as it got close to solid bodies. And that theory, of course, could be tested. And it was tested during a solar eclipse, I think might have been the late 1910s, I think, or 1920s. It was tested during a solar eclipse. And to much surprise from the scientific community, who at the time largely agreed with Newtonian physics, Einstein was proven correct. Well, at least his theory wasn't falsified. The Newtonian physics theory that light was a constant and wouldn't change was falsified. So we went from having a Newtonian view of the theory of light to a relative view of light, which Einstein established. And Popper compared the theories of Einstein to those of another famous thinker of the time, Sigmund Freud, who invented psychoanalysis. And he usefully did compare and say that, well, the theories of psychoanalysis couldn't be falsified, that there weren't actual predictions made by Sigmund Freud and his followers that could be tested and falsified. Now, that's not to say that Freud's theories are useless or shouldn't still be studied and considered. What it is to say is to actually clarify what it means to be scientific. What does science mean? Well, science, in Popper's view, and a view I definitely think has some merit, is about having those testable and verifiable conjectures and then subjecting them to real-world data. And Freud's theory on psychoanalysis couldn't be done. So that wasn't science. Popper described his theory as critical rationalism, that it was about, of course, being rationalistic and about the theories, about providing rational data, and it was about being critical to those theories. It wasn't just inductivism. It wasn't just saying that because the sun has risen every day since I've been born at least, or I think since the start of time perhaps, that tomorrow the sun will rise up too. That's induction. That's saying because something has happened every time before, it will happen again in the future. Well, Popper said that's not actually science. What science is saying is we put up a theory that the sun will rise tomorrow, and we don't know if it's true or not until we actually get up tomorrow and see if it has. It is scientific, that statement, because it can be falsified. It is a verifiable statement. And Popper's theories led to a real revolution in science. Before Popper, we did really think about science in an inductive way. We would think about science as being logical, as Senator Rice established, that we'd be able to say statements in science like, if Socrates is a man, then Socrates is mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. That would be a scientific statement because you'd be inducing something from certain established facts. Well, after Popper, it was more likely to characterise science in a falsifying or a disconfirming manner, so that we'd say things like, if Socrates is a god, then Socrates is immortal. Socrates is not immortal, therefore Socrates is not a god. We'd use the negative to think about scientific theories. Popper's theory is that we cannot actually prove that a conjecture is true. There is no way of actually doing that. We can't prove it. All we can do is prove that it is false. And if a conjecture is proven not to be true, then the above logic is used to dismiss that conjecture. I think a couple of quotes from Popper help sum this up more usefully. One that I like is that if we are uncritical, we shall always find what we want. We shall look for and find confirmations, and we shall always look away from and not see whatever might be dangerous to our pet theories. In this way, it is only too easy to obtain what appears to be overwhelming evidence in favour of a theory which, if approached critically, would have been refuted. And another quote from Popper that I like is that whenever a theory appears to you as being the only possible true one, take this as a sign that you have neither understood the theory nor the problem which was intended to solve. And I like this last quote because even though that last quote was made in the 1950s, I do think it usefully sums up some of the problems that I have with our modern approach to science, and particularly the language around it. We are often told that the science is spoken. Indeed, Senator Rice emoted science as some being almost, some transient being, that the science is shaking its hands around or science is doing certain things. Well, science does not do any such thing. If you agree with Popper's theories, which I largely do, science can ever only make conjectures or hypotheses, not conclusions, not anything precisely true. And we can usefully base our understanding of the world on those conjectures that have withstood testing and have yet to be falsified. Well, these statements are often made about many different areas of science. We often think science does many different things. I do want to touch on the one that is most commonly put up to a lack of scientific scrutiny, in my view, and that's climate change. I think it's important because whenever you talk about climate change, there's a propensity to distort and deceive about what someone has said about it. I want to put on the record what I think at the moment, at least. I'm not a scientist, I don't know, but I have read quite a bit of the literature. I think that there certainly appears evidence that carbon dioxide warms an atmosphere. Indeed, that can be tested. You can do that in a lab, and people do that in the lab. And carbon dioxide certainly warms atmospheres in a laboratory environment. It is much more different, though, to then conclude that the actual increase in carbon dioxide emissions we've experienced on our planet have caused an increase in global temperatures, and a much, much different hypothesis again to say that these increases will cause catastrophic global warming that leads to extreme weather events, the deaths of polar bears, and apparently, according to the Sydney Morning Herald, will lead to bread not rising as much as it has in the past. And I don't exaggerate there, Senator Ronaldson. Indeed, if I was a schoolboy right now, I'd love climate change, because instead of saying the dog ate my homework, I could just say climate change did it. It can explain so many things, apparently, these days. Now, these hypotheses are conjectures that are made. We can test whether bread will rise as much as it has in the past and the future, but we, of course, can't do that till the future. And what I'm concerned, though, is not that climate change science doesn't generate falsifiable conclusions, it's that when it does, and then the theories are tested, and an answer comes back different, the goalposts get moved. So there has been modelled predictions from climate change scientists in the last 20 decades, and almost all of them have been proven to be far too exaggerated. That the temperature, on whatever series you use, whether it's HAD-CRUT, UAH, RSS, these are all measures of global temperatures around the world, all of them have been proven to not rise in line with the theories. So we can conjecture and we can debate whether they have been falsified. They certainly have not been verified at this stage, and there certainly needs to be a lot more work done in this field. And that's what concerns me most about this debate, that we speak often about climate change as if we know it all, and we certainly don't know it all. I did study philosophy at university. I was a great fan of Socrates and his dialogues, and his most famous thing was that the true wisdom is to know when you know that you don't know it all, and we don't know it all. We certainly don't know it all. There's much we don't know about the universe, and that's why we need science to continue to explore and understand more about our universe. And also, I want to just conclude my contribution to this debate with some final remarks from Karl Popper on this subject, which I think usefully captures this wisdom. And Karl Popper did say once that, "For it was my master who taught me not only how very little I knew, but also that any wisdom to which I might ever aspire could consist only in realising more fully the infinity of my ignorance." Thank you, Mr. Deputy President.
Thank you.